Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to Hugging the Cactus, a Mel Gibson podcast. And today we check into the Continental Hotel, compliments of Mel Gibson. And away we go. The Continental from the world of John Wick, because this is a John Wick prequel series, mini-series on Peacock in America and Prime in the rest of the world. You really have to wonder if From the World of John Wick is a studio note. Yes, we do have to include that in the title, otherwise no one will watch this thing, because why would you watch anything that is an original IP? Because that's the irony of this show. Yes, it is complete world building for John Wick, down to insane details, but it does stand on its own. It is, in fact, an enjoyable show. You really have to wonder what this show would be like and if it would actually be renewed if it had stood on its own legs. Unfortunately, we will never get that chance. This origin story of sorts centers around the proprietor Winston, who we know from the, 5 different John Wick movies? Basically the guy who runs the hotel. This Winston apparently had quite an adventure getting this hotel, and that's what this miniseries is all about. The opening credits reveal quite a bit about what this episode and the subsequent 2 other episodes will be about, because they more or less explain the upcoming plot. Now, if you want to know more about this, I suggest you watch a YouTube show called Screen Crush, because they go into, great detail on how basically everything is foreshadowed in the leader of the show, or really spoiled. Now, are we here to discuss the world of John Wick? No, not really. Are we here to discuss the true merits of this show? No, not really. Well, then why are we here? Well, we are here to discuss Mel Gibson. And Mel Gibson is a big part of this show. In fact, Mel Gibson is the main antagonist. He's the bad guy. He's the guy who is supposed to die at the end of the show for that feel-good moment. If he doesn't die, the heroes don't win. So really this is another analysis of bad guy Mel, and does he do enough on this show to make you hate him? Now, obviously he was cast because people hate him, and so he's the guy you root for to get killed. And in order for that to have any stakes and have any real significance, he really must be not only formidable, he must also be very evil, and he must have an actual chance to win. Now this is interesting because his portrayal is quite layered, because obviously he's not the main bad guy. The bunch of creepy people who run that shady murder organization called the High Council, those are the real bad guys, and they are represented by a figure called the Adjudicator, which is a chick with a plastic mask. Well, what does Mel Gibson's character do? Well, Mel Gibson's character is really, he represents chaos, and the hotel and the High Council and that whole world and that whole organization are all about order. They're a bunch of fascists. So Mel plays Cormac O'Connor, owner and proprietor of the Continental, and he runs this with an iron fist. You can tell that he was a henchman once, because he has that criminal callousness, that uncaring sense, where he basically condemns guy to death with a kind of cynicism, because obviously he was in that position many times by people whose position he now occupies. That position is precarious, and as the series progresses and he gets into deeper and deeper problems, that precarious position becomes, obviously a death sentence. He has these great quotes like, "The High Table wants to send me to the glue factory," which is kind of a allusion to what they do to horses when, you can't run them at races anymore. Now, if you watch the Screen Crush YouTube show, they will explain to you in great detail why horses are so important in this show, because they represent. Cormac, they explain, means charioteer, someone who drives horses. And the chariot, of course, is the Continental. Nice little allegory. Now, as the show starts, a lot of characters are introduced, and I mean a ridiculous lot of them. Halfway through the first episode, I start to think, well, what do we need all these people for? Where is this going? Are we going to see them return in the second season? Because that's really what you start thinking in the third part, because a lot of these storylines that are started aren't really resolved, so they sort of must have had a second season in mind, or this must build to something in the movies with Keanu Reeves. One thing that is not even hinted at, but is sort of obvious, is that one of the brothers, one of the Scott brothers, is obviously the father of John Wick. The show starts with an incident centered around two boys who have caused some kind of arson. People have fallen victim. And the older of the two boys takes the blame, even though it was the younger boy who threw the Molotov cocktail. Now, the younger boy is Winston. The older boy is Frankie. He goes to jail, and they grow up on the rough patch of town. Frankie becomes a crook. He is somehow connected to that whole hotel, high council, high chair, whatever they are. Frankie turns out to have a Vietnamese girlfriend, a wife. He's a cold-blooded killer, a Vietnam veteran, and she is well, we don't really know, but she came with Frankie back to America. They wanted to start a family, suggesting she might be in the family way. In the family way with their son John, perhaps. It's not really explained, but it's an obvious hint. I mean, mommy is really good at martial arts. Now, the filmmakers, showrunners, showmakers, whatever we call them these days in this era of streaming, they're obviously big Kubrick fans. There's more than a little hint of Tarantino and Robert Rodriguez in there. And the heavy use of color schemes kind of suggests they at some point were influenced by the Trois Couleurs series by Kieslowski, who made movies basically with colors. He made blue, he made blanc, which is white, and he made red, rouge, and the color actually plays a significant part in how the whole movie is shot, as is this series, because in this series, and it's the same for the John Wick movies, yellow or gold stands for hope, red stands for evil and violence, and blue stands for peace, or when the protagonist is somehow in control. Now that's interesting, of course, because that's not what Kieslowski did. Kieslowski related those colors to the French flag and the tenets of the French Revolution, which is liberté, égalité, and fraternité, or liberty, equality, and brotherhood. Obviously, in this murderous upside-down world, it stands for something very different. Now, Keanu Reeves, of course, thrives in worlds that are upside-down, crazy, murderous, and strange. We've seen many of his movies like that, so obviously that's one of the reasons why John Wick was so fantastic. I mean, let's talk about John Wick for a few seconds. That is an absolute classic. I still love that movie, although I've seen it on very few occasions, because I really can't stand the fact that they murdered a puppy. You don't hurt a cute little puppy like that, and that basically gives him universal license to go on a mass murdering killing spree. And you are completely behind him. You as the viewer are in cahoots with this murderer who kills and kills and kills indiscriminately because they hurt his puppy. The puppy in this case is the death of Frankie at the end of the first episode. Spoilers. Now, obviously someone had to get killed in order for Winston Scott to become motivated to take down Cormac O'Connor and take his hotel away from him, which is the goal he sets himself at the end of the first episode. Now, most of the second episode, which is relatively short and ironically directed by a different director, is mostly his problems finding enough allies and having them all centered around Cormac to take him down. And of course, the third episode is the convoluted resolution where heavy world building for the John Wick series takes place. It's not easily resolved. You have to watch the third episode several times to even understand it. But I think what makes the show so great, aside from the great soundtrack, aside from the fantastic cinematography, aside from the Rodriguez-like feel of filming, because it really does look like some kind of sequel in the same world of Sin City. In fact, that's really my only complaint about this show. It tries a little too hard to be cool. And part of being cool is being original. And that's the one thing that this show isn't. Because it's trapped in this John Wick world it's supposed to build. I think, really, that's its main detriment. I more or less alluded to this starting this episode. I think this series would have been served much better if it had stood on its own, if it had nothing to do with John Wick, if it had been its own story with its own set of characters. It would have made much more sense. This feels shoehorned, and that's a shame because it's just so very good. Let me give you an example. So the director, Robert Hughes, he loves the movie Taxi Driver, the Robert De Niro movie. Scorsese. So Frankie escapes from the Continental, gets picked up with a cab that his wife, girlfriend, the Vietnamese chick drives. It's a replica. It's the exact same cab that Robert De Niro drives in Taxi Driver. I mean, that cab has no business there, except, well, Taxi Driver's in the 70s. This movie is in, 1975? It makes perfect sense. So Taxi Driver is in that universe. That's just a really cool thing. So, Robert Hughes, the director, also did The Book of Eli, he did Menace to Society, he did From Hell. He's done a bunch of pretty cool stuff. But he hasn't really done anything of this note in a while. And when you look down this production, that's kind of the common denominator. So, how did this whole thing come about? Well, originally they thought of this in 2017 somewhere. Chad Stahelski, who did all the other movies, conceived it, and it went to the pre-production, and it just went from hand to hand, and finally it ended up with the current crop of showrunners. Now, who are these guys? Well, they're like the cast. Basically, nobodies, and they've been around for a long time. So, basically you have Greg Coolidge, Sean Simmons, and Kirk Ward. Kirk Ward is also in the show. He's the adjudicator's henchman, the bald, creepy guy who headbutts people to death. He's probably the more accomplished of the three because he has like 40 acting credits, everything from The Island to Zombieland to Wayne. Now, Wayne is a show that connects the three showrunners, really. It's the project immediately preceding this. So, Kirk wrote Wayne, and he also has producer credit on it. Same with Sean Simmons. He co-wrote Wayne, which is a show about a kid whose car gets stolen and he chases the thief on a dirt bike. Same with Greg Coolidge, bit part actor, produced a little here and there. Now he's showrunner of Wayne. And he wrote Employee of the Month, if you've seen that movie. And he wrote ride along, which is decent. So here are three guys kind of from the bowels of Hollywood, roped into to write and produce and run this show as a streaming thing on Prime, kind of left to be forgotten, except they actually come up with a really cool, really watchable show. Now, the middle episode is directed by Charlotte Brandström, who directed episodes of The Witcher and The Rings of Power. Sorry, I just vomited a little in my mouth. And Shogun and The Outsiders. So she's just basically a gun for hire, and maybe they needed a female director to get more money for the show, to check a box. That's probably the reason. Now, the music in this show is just mind-blowing. I mean, the score is just fantastic. It's done by an artist called Rafferty, who does a lot of scoring, mostly British shows, but he also did like the season 3 finale of Suits and another Prime show called Zone 414. Again, a guy who's just really good, and here he's just collecting a paycheck and accidentally just gives off work that is just mind-blowingly good, because this soundtrack is just fantastic. It's worth watching the series for alone. It's amazing. Now, the cast is really... the main star, obviously, is Mel Gibson, giving Hollywood a villain to hate. And supposedly the audience... he's an outstanding villain in this piece. The hero, of course, Winston Scott, is played by Colin Woodall. He's a nobody. He basically played a part on The Stewardess. I haven't even seen that. Then there's Michelle Prada, who plays the police officer KD, or KD, if you see it as an acronym. She had a part in Riverdale. Then there's Yen, played by Noon Kate, who's a very interesting actress, who I could talk for about an hour, I suspect. I'm going to be doing a deep dive into her, because she's like my real discovery of this series. She was a Vietnamese TV star, and she's done a ton of stuff, so I'm very interested in her career. Then there's the brother, Frankie, played by Ben Robson. I remember him from Vikings, actually. He was in it for a couple of seasons. He played Kath. And he was also on Animal Kingdom, and he played Craig Cody. Then there is Sharon, the proprietor in the movies, played by Ayu Adigun, who, unfortunately for him, is in the new Hunger Games. The one you don't remember, the one that flopped, played by Zegler. So here you have a cast that is relatively inexpensive. They could just pay these people scale, because they're really not known for anything, except for Mel Gibson, who probably got a ton of money. The budget for this show was $60 million. You can see they spent it on CG for the most part. And the CGI does really look good. It's really unknown what kind of box office it did, obviously, because it's a TV show and it's on streaming, so the amount of views it gets is unknown, undeclared. Who knows how these shows do? We really don't know anymore, which is one of the reasons I would never invest in streaming companies, because really their business model is a little screwy, in my opinion. Now, I could get into all kinds of plot details, but this is a very complex plot, and it has very complex characters. It's way more complicated than John Wick and any of his 3 or 4 or how many sequels it has. So it's really worth watching just for that, because it's just a good unfolding story. And I really don't want to spoil it, except for, that the potential father of John Wick, Frankie, dies at the end of the first episode, but that's, crucial for the plot to happen and kind of predictable. So what I'd really like to do is just talk about Mel's performance. You don't see much of him in the first episode, but he does come off well in the second one. There's a little subplot with the proprietor. He's gay and he has a boyfriend who is a classical musician, a cellist. And Cormac kills him because he doesn't want his proprietor to leave. This is the linchpin for proprietor to betray Cormac, which is also essential to the plot of the third episode. Now, Cormac is a Judas figure, and I suspect that's what attracted Mel to this part. Not money, but that he could play a dastardly biblical figure. It's suggested all over the place with religious imagery and behavior, like giving the boyfriend a kiss. This is, of course, how the Romans could identify Jesus, because Judas kissed him on the cheek. That's how they knew it was him, so they could crucify him. Cormac does the same thing. And you can tell Mel was in this from the ground up, because there's this character called Jenkins, who's a sniper. And he quotes Riggs from Lethal Weapon while he's sniping. It's the, come on, Cottontail, stick your head out. That's the scene. And actually Jenkins says the same thing before he shoots someone. Of course, Riggs has been alluded to in movies before. I mean, just an episode ago I talked about Expendables 3, and the character he plays in that, Stonebanks, is actually sniping Caesar in that film. So everybody just likes to refer to Lethal Weapon a lot, I guess. In the third episode, the Cormac character kind of goes crazy. He starts sniffing liquid ecstasy. He just goes nuts, basically. The pendulum swings back and forth a few times between Cormac and Winston. Ultimately, of course, the proprietor is the deciding factor. And this is where they give Mel also kind of a callback to his own career, because he gets to be racist. Because at some point he says, well, you know, I'll just, I'm gonna, if you betray me, I'm just gonna send you back to Zimbabwe in pieces. And the response he gets to that is, I'm from Nigeria. The renegade cop KD finally swims back into the pictures. He's been kind of in the show, pointlessly in the show, the entire show. But of course, she's essential to resolving the issue between Winston and Cormac. In fact, she has a personal vendetta against Winston because it was her family and who was burned by the Molotov cocktail he threw into that window as a child. So she's been hunting them ever since. And that's revealed at the beginning of the show because she's having sex with her boss in her filthy apartment, riding him cowgirl, and her burnt skin is revealed. It's not much of a spoiler to say that Cormac, played by Mel Gibson, comes to his eventual demise. And then, of course, there's the closing scene that Winston has with the adjudicator, basically to set himself up as the manager of the Continental. And then really the movie John Wick starts about a couple of decades later. As I said, this is a really classy show. The action is fantastic. It's filmed wonderfully. The soundtrack is amazing. There's good performances all around. It's well directed. Pretty much everyone on this show is overachieving. This series is way, way better than it has any right to be. Even for that budget. It's really, I can't recommend it enough. It's well worth watching, even if you don't care about John Wick at all. I actually really enjoyed the original. I don't enjoy the franchise as much, but nevertheless, you can watch this even without watching the movies. Again, another solid villain performance by Mel Gibson. He does that so well. But then again, he does everything really well. I hope you enjoy the Continental, and I'll be seeing you.